and we are staying in criminal mode right now here in the afternoon show as we turn to crime fictions. Synopsis for some books do send a shiver down your spine, and that's true of 16 Horses, the debut novel by Borders-based Greg Buchanan. It's set in a rundown seaside town. See, that's atmospheric already, isn't it? And the crime thriller centres on local police detective Alec Nichols, who discovers, wait for it, ladies and gentlemen, 16 horses' heads on a farm, each buried with a single eye facing the low winter sun. It's been called a unique and ambitious debut, highly suspenseful, beautifully written. I can vouch for that. Val McDermott's a fan as well. The novel is out on Thursday, and Greg Buchanan is with me. Welcome to the afternoon show, Greg.
Hello.
Nice to have you on the show. Sorry, you just hello, having just listened to. No, it's just making me laugh because that's a bit of a contrast to that premise, the attention-grabbing opening gambit of 16 Horses. Do you want to tell us anything about that? Was it a big light bulb moment, or did it evolve slowly, this idea?
Oh, yes, it evolved quite slowly, actually. Initially, I wanted to write about the town. The town was the main idea, and I was quite inspired by a lot of different places I visited throughout the UK, and wanted to write about collapse and disappearance, and a lot of pressures being placed upon a particular location. And I wanted to write a scene that was going to introduce all these kind of way too complex ideas I had for this novel, and I wanted it to almost be a kind of mythic, kind of biblical almost omen of things to come. And often in those kind of mythic stories, you have a discovery of something being wrong with animals, dead kind of animals in the fields, two-headed lambs being born, and there's kind of end time portents. And I decided to do a bit of a twist on it in that I was thinking about those kind of herd animals like cows and stuff that are often used in those types of settings. And something about a horse is similar but very different in terms of the way we treat it and receive it. And I wrote a kind of practice scene with that in mind. And I was in a writing workshop at the time during the creative writing course at UEA I took a few years back. And the class received that way more positively than the kind of way too complex novel I was working on prior to that. And I had, when I'd worked it out, it was going to be a big plot line throughout that novel, but it was going to be one of like 6 totally different stories that were going to go on. And everyone just said, Greg, you need to calm down and just do the horse thing rather than the other things. So it kind of span out of it's almost a spin off of this other novel I was going to write. And ended up being about the horses.
That's really interesting. It's always good to get an insight into how ideas take off. And UAE that you're saying, UEA, University of East Anglia, which of course has an incredible writing course there and has produced many people over the years. But again, I often say on this show, there are many people listening who are writers, some at the beginning, some trying it out maybe for the first time and wondering how the heck you crack it, and others who are very seasoned. And the thing about you, I'm so interested in you immediately talking about a mythic angle, and you have written scripts for video games, you've written graphic novels, and in those formats, the world's your oyster, really. You can go anywhere, can't you? And there's a big expectation from readers for you to raise the bar and really go for it. Has that been a good way to limber up in a way for writing the novel?
Oh, definitely. So when I was in the video game field, you work on lots of different projects. So I did for-hire work for other companies, but I also did stuff of my own independently as well. And someone said the other day that video games, although some people watching the show will have different experiences with video games. Some of them might be imagining more like Tetris or Mario, and others might be imagining quite complex, almost choose-your-own adventure films, which some games resemble. And I've written all these different types of things. And what I say to people is, so I struggled quite a lot in my novel writing about 10 years ago. And I wrote very pretentious, kind of very quite haughty stuff at the time, I think. And I didn't really know what I was doing with my writing. I think for a long time I was really struggling to try and find my voice. And I felt one thing that writing in other media really taught me was experience and pacing structure. So in video games, a hugely important thing is not just that kind of playfulness with genre and kind of concepts that you just alluded to, but thinking about how someone is going to very tangibly interact with the material that you're creating for them in the story. Like they're actually going to be moving throughout that space and doing things and manipulating it. And one thing I think that's interesting is that novels can be viewed in quite a similar way, even though they're not often viewed as experiences. But they are. You're creating experiences in a way that the experience from the other medium is quite helpful. And I almost think that some of the flaws in my writing before I worked in video games were really edged out, and a lot of kind of perhaps unusual influences were gained as a novelist as a result of that material. And I think also in terms of genre flexibility, that's something I've always quite enjoyed. 16 Horses, although it's primarily a kind of crime thriller mystery, has some quite literary elements, for example. It has some elements that are almost like a horror novel in that it never goes into the supernatural. It's not that kind of book, and it's not overly grisly or anything. But some of the kind of way in which the horror genre would treat a kind of an object of terror or something that might be scary, there are certain ways in which other genres often don't approach similar topics in the same way. There's quite a lot of
Yes.
stratification, whereas I don't, perhaps because of the video game background, I don't see any problem with. And in fact, I find it quite fun to play around with all those codes, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. No, it's really illuminating. And you are going to illuminate our listeners further by giving us a short reading. Now, do you need to tell us where we are, what's going on here?
Sure. At this point in the book, it's chapter 6, reasonably early on, and the horses have been discovered in the field, and a veterinarian has come to town, one of our main two characters, to look into it. And we've had some kind of setup about what's going on and the location and so on. And at this point, it's the first night after the discovery, and it's raining, and everyone's moving around the dark.
Thank you.
The tents shook in the storm, barely holding up against the onslaught of rain. Already water leaked into them, coalescing near the head of a young mare, a chestnut-coloured horse who had been called Sally. She had been her owner's best friend. It was hard to see any of this. There were no streetlights, not this far from town. If you stood in those fields that night, you would not have been able to see anyone, even if they were standing right next to you, even if they were looking right at you. You wouldn't see their grey-hooded gas mask. You wouldn't see their tight rubber gloves. It's a beautiful thing to be seen. Stars, dead for millennia, kept faith. They walked out into the night.
Thank you very much indeed. That is Greg Buchanan reading from his first novel, 16 Horses. And yeah, absolutely very atmospheric reading there. Tell us about the setting then. We said this rundown, decaying seaside town. Tell us a little bit about this place, and maybe, I think you might have said earlier, possibly inspiration from various places actually, so not one particular place that you're sort of memorialising in fiction.
No, definitely. It's part of the setting was inspired. So during when I was at UEA and I was doing the creative writing course, my parents visited for the day. And rather than wanting to hang around anywhere I live or frequent or see anything like that, they wanted to go off on a journey. So we went to Great Yarmouth for the day. But it ended up being quite an overcast, quite dark, dismal day, and no one was really there. But something about a seaside town totally devoid of people in that kind of really bad day was really inspirational. The kind of mood of it, the look of it, the feel of it, and certain descriptions in the novel of there being lines of arcades with all of their lights on and no one inside holds true of that place. So I returned to Great Yarmouth quite a few times as a primary inspiration. I've also spent quite a lot of time in the kind of northern parts of Scotland, such as Thurso and Wick, and in around those kind of areas. Partly the long fields and the descriptions of farms and stuff are really drawn from those locations where I've done lambing and farm work myself. And I've married those locations and various other places I've been. I do quite a lot of hiking, quite a lot of walks. So a lot of descriptions of woods are drawn from that kind of landscape and pushed them all geographically into the same kind of almost fantastical place. And then it's described as being quite far from anywhere else in the UK, and that it takes hours to get to in a way that's not entirely possible. So I wanted that sense of it being far from the edge of everything to an almost make-believe extent.
It's always good to have somebody like Val McDermid big up your novel as she has done. Clearly, there's that whole, forgive the term, but loosely, it's that the whole tart noir phenomenon in Scotland. So many brilliant writers. There are many police procedurals, but there are all sorts of other novels that have emerged, and some very much focusing on that idea of the land and the atmosphere of place and people and how it affects behaviour and all of that. Do you have any specific influences you think that have come to bear in terms of other novel writers, fiction writers, with this book?
Sure. In terms of novels, a huge influence for me has always been Stephen King. So as a young age, as a teenager, I was super into Stephen King stories. And I have a whole kind of elaborate backstory. I was hit by a car when I was about 12 and in the hospital. To cut a long story short, my dad had a bunch of Stephen King books with him, so I fell in love with him as a writer at the time, and I tracked down everything he did and so on. And a lot of the influences of this novel actually ended up being kind of film and cinema as well. So I'm super into the works of David Lynch, for example, and Blue Velvet in particular. Was a big influence on the tone. Also stuff like Don't Look Now, and in particular, a huge influence on this, perhaps more so than anything else, is Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock film adaptation, which the mood and the kind of feel of that kind of sense of dread at a nowhere place, and how the community and the school responds to a series of disappearances and awful events, and the way that it concentrated more on the emotions of the characters around these things was really
Yeah.
something I loved, and trying to do something similar in my own writing.
Oh, you're making me feel giddy. All of those films have had a big impact on me, but it's so interesting for people who've not read the novel. Just with the beginning of what you were talking about, one can totally imagine it. Just that it seems very visual. So it's interesting to find that film has played a big part in your life too. And I believe, so the novel, not quite out yet, already been picked up by Netflix. Hashtag
Oh,
Hod Me Back. Tell us about this. Is this true?
not Netflix. We haven't announced any where it's coming out yet. But it's what's been announced is studios
Yeah.
who are apparently the first film studio in the world, and they're also the kind of international studio behind stuff like Narcos and Tin Star and Hannibal. They've picked up a series for adaptation, which was announced a few days ago on Variety. So I'm super excited about that. And there was a little bit of a bidding war, and different people were contacting me and stuff. So I felt very important for a few weeks. But they really had a creative vision very similar to my own. So it'll be very, as I said, no announcements have been made yet about where it's coming out, what's going with it.
Okay.
But yeah, very exciting.
Keep an eye on Goma. How brilliant. That's really exciting for you. Greg, thank you so much for coming on the show, and haste you back when you get the Oscars in a few years' time or whatever. Thank you so much. Very best of luck with the book.
Thank you.